Hi everyone, it's Dr. Leola here, and this is our class lecture, video lecture on San Junipero and some cultural connections and some kind of broader media studies and theoretical connections to make with that episode. So I hope you're all continuing to do well with these new kind of online remote learning conditions, that you're all taking care of yourselves and all that good stuff. Before going into this lecture, I just want to say that I am making the assumption here that you have read the reading on affect and the reading on queerness, and that you've of course watched the episode of San Junipero. So major spoilers for the episode forthcoming. So if you haven't done those things, please go do that before continuing with this video lecture. If you have done those things and you're kind of sticking with us here, in this video, I'm going to kind of look at three particular things related to San Junipero. First, I want to kind of talk through how this is playing with traditions of kind of long traditions of imagining ways to live forever, especially based in with digital technologies. This is a long history and a long narrative and media history, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk about San Junipero and as it relates to the affect reading that you all had. For that, I'm going to focus most of my attention here on just helping you all clarify what affect is and how affect works. Since you've already done a little bit of work of doing that connection between affect and San Junipero in your discussion posts, and thinking about how the soundtrack affects our affective response to this episode. So I'm going to focus mostly on kind of clarifying some of the points from that reading, but I will draw some connections to the episode as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk about queer theory and queerness as a position, as it kind of operates more academically than just popularly, and as we kind of see it playing out in San Junipero as a queer text. So that's probably going to take up the bulk of this video, because there's actually kind of a good amount of history and context that I want to clarify for you all, especially if you have read that piece and are kind of maybe a bit confused by some of the references that Karen Tongson makes, or reeling a bit from that reading. So I'm going to spend some time there as well to try to illuminate that for you all. And then as a reminder, before we really get into a lot of this, your kind of class participation credit for this week is a lecture guide. So that is a viewing guide with just a series of questions. It's set up like a Moodle quiz that are specifically referring to things that happen in this lecture. So make sure that you have that open either in another tab or on another screen or whatever, like if you're watching this on your phone or something. Make sure you have that open kind of while you're going through this, just to kind of do that as kind of efficiently with your time as possible. Okay, so our first kind of broad topic for San Junipero is first kind of placing it within this kind of big imaginary space that it plays with of imagining ways to live forever and to use digital technology to help us avoid mortality. So of course this is kind of like the clear crux of this episode, right? The story is entirely built around San Junipero, right? This virtual world where when you die, you have the option to kind of spend your eternity in this virtual environment, because you'll simply upload your consciousnness and it'll be stored on a server kind of forever, right? So your body may die, but your mind lives on, and you get to spend kind of the rest of time in this virtual environment called San Junipero. And this is something that hopefully is by now becoming somewhat familiar, but this is again based in this idea that's kind of a long-standing idea throughout kind of Western culture, that the reason that we are mortal is because of our bodies, right? So that it's our bodies that are weak, our bodies that kind of give out and stop being able to continue existing, rather than our minds. Or that when our minds kind of give out, when our minds fall apart, that is because they are kind of our consciousness is stored in this physical embodied thing that is our brain, right? So it's that our brain stops physically operating, not that our ability to think or our mind and consciousness as such, it's not that dies out, right? And so it's getting a little bit funky, but it's basically kind of says that that the self of who we are is this other thing that's kind of our thoughts and our minds, and that our bodies are the reason that we die, right? And so that if we could just kind of like fix the body, then we could be immortal, right? And we could kind of live forever if we could just figure out how to keep our bodies going, or get rid of our bodies, right? So this is a theme we've kind of visited a lot throughout this semester, but it's also kind of the logic behind like contemporary things like cryogenics, right? Which is the practice of freezing your body after you die, so that kind of like once science catches up with, you know, whatever made you die, you can get that treatment and be kind of resurrected and thawed out with your mind fully intact. And it's also kind of a long dream of digital technology. So we haven't done a lot in this class of kind of like digital history, but basically kind of since the advent of the computer, we've done a lot of work culturally to place the computer on similar lines to humanity and the human body. And so kind of within that work, we kind of see this long kind of imaginary history of like, what if we could just upload ourselves into a computer and live forever in a digital space? We see this across like science fictional texts, books, TV shows, movies, video games, and so on. I'm sure that you all have probably seen a lot of examples of this, and I'm hoping that that'll come up in the facilitation on Wednesday. But so instead of kind of going through that fictional space, I'm actually going to turn to kind of where this plays out in kind of computer culture more broadly. So if we think about computers, right, there's this large metaphor, as I said, of making computers accessible to the public by tying computers to humanity, right, and to metaphors of humanness. So for instance, if we think about, I'm sorry, let me back up. So part of tying computers to humanity is by kind of creating this split where our brains or our minds are the software that runs the computer, the code that takes in information and processes it, and then our bodies are the hardware, right? The physical thing that exists in the world that makes that information accessible and makes it useful. And we see this kind of more broadly throughout how we understand computers if we think about the words we use to describe computers, even today, and so on. And those are things like memory, right? Like we have memory, computers have memory, intelligence, whether actual or artificial. We often think about computers as being smart or as thinking machines, right? All these kinds of adjectives that are tied to humans, human minds, human ways of being, human ways of making sense of the world, and so on. Right, and so that is, as I said, kind of by design, because it does make computers less scary for the public and makes them more accepted. But it also kind of sets us up for this really kind of ripe area of exploring, like, what if, are we just computers? What if we could just be in a computer forever? Like, where does our mind stop acting like software, for instance? And this, of course, should sound basically familiar now as another version of our fan favorite, the mind-body split, right? So that idea that we've been talking about for quite a while now, that the mind and the body are two separate things. They can be separated, but of course, as we've kind of said, they really can't be separated because our mind is tied to our body in these very precise ways. And this, again, this should hopefully be reviewed, but this connection of the mind separate from the body also ties to long-standing histories that value the mind over the body, right? And that kind of look at the mind as a thing to be that's very important and much more important than the body. So in some ways, this may seem to run counter to what we talked about relating to USS Callister 2 weeks ago, right? Because of course for USS Callister, when we think about modes of masculinity and modes of desirable being, the geek figure, right? That's Robert Daly as the geek figure, right? The geek is only a mind. The geek is only valued because of his mind, and he's less valued than like his embodied counterparts, right? And this is kind of a version of the like jocks versus geeks concept, right? Where the jock is the kind of more sexually viable person, and the geek isn't, right? And this is, again, like a kind of a long-standing trope. But when we're talking about the mind-body split here, just a reminder that that is like a much longer philosophical history, going back to the Enlightenment, right? And that this, besides where the jock and and the geek are kind of two forms of masculine being. The mind-body split actually has these kind of really expansive gender dimensions and class dimensions that have to do with that value set, right? So bodies, if we think, again, kind of long history of bodies, bodies are used for laboring, right? That's how we do work. Especially like physical labor. They're dirty, they smell, they emote, right? And so on. Whereas the mind, by contrast, is this kind of like clean, focused, rational, thinking, calm, collected, kind of educated space, right? So if we map this onto people, right, it's the people who are embodied and who are kind of reduced to their bodies and unvalued because of that are poor people, enslaved people, women, children, right? And those who are who get kind of to be minded, right, or who get to be valued because of their minds are traditionally and historically your kind of white, rich, free men, educated, and so on, who get that historical pleasure of being like in their minds, right, and being valued for their minds. And again, I want to be clear, this is a long historical tradition, I think hundreds and hundreds of years of history, right? So when we talk about the mind-body split and the value of the mind over the body in Western culture, we need to be thinking about this long history, right? This long Western tradition that kind of sets up and maintains this value system and these kinds of associations. That even though from our vantage point today in 2020, you can probably point to lots of ways that this isn't the case, in lots of places where this is kind of being taken apart, right? We need to remember that that's a historically new phenomenon, that this mind-body split and the value system is being challenged, right? And thinking about that, right, challenging the mind-body split and challenging the valuing of the mind over the body actually moves us really nicely to our next topic for today, which is affect. So part of your work for San Junipero was to post to the discussion board thinking about the ways that this episode plays on affect, right? Which is kind of the ways that it makes you feel. And for your formal analysis, right, that was kind of thinking about specifically how the soundtrack helps support that affective response that you have to this episode. And hopefully you did that while reading the piece on affect by Carrie Rentschler. But in case not, I just want to go through and clarify a few of the points of affect, because I know that can be kind of a theoretical space that can get a little funky and be a little bit hard to understand. So I'm going to explain what I think are kind of some of the core points to take away from that piece, but this is not a replacement for reading it, right? So please do take the time to read that. So affect theory, right, is a way of studying media or of thinking about culture, thinking about narrative through affect, right? And affect specifically calls for rethinking and privileging the felt aspects of everyday life, social change and durable structures of power in their non-representational aspects, right? So shortly and simply, right, this is kind of a heavy statement, but shortly and simply, this basically means that affect theory is about approaching media and approaching cultural study by focusing on what we feel or how we feel, rather than on what we think or how we think, right? So instead of taking in a text and critically analyzing it for how it makes you think, it's instead taking in a text and engaging how it makes you feel, right? And kind of sitting with those feelings and focusing on those feelings. So it's, as I said, it's how it makes us feel. Other questions that it can ask is who it makes feel certain ways, right? So how it might make me feel one way and you all feel another way, and how our positions in the world might affect those different points of feeling. And then the other space where affect theory draws our attention to media is in how it creates this feeling or how it creates this felt response. So you can see, again, all of that through this, what I tried to set up for this past week, right? Which is how does San Junipero make you feel, right? Why do you think it made you feel this way? And then how specifically does the sound help you feel this way, right? How does the sound communicate these kinds of feelings? But thinking kind of outside of just this class and thinking affect more broadly, right? And thinking about affect as this call to focus on the felt relationships to media and to narrative. If we think about that in terms of the mind-body split, you can see, I think, how this challenges that particular value system. Because what affect theory essentially does is it asks us to focus on or to center the body over the mind when we approach media, right? Or to think about how media are experiences in our bodies rather than experiences in our minds. And this is in a lot of ways an incredibly feminine or feminist way of approaching media because it is centering feelings and centering the body. And as we'll kind of talk about a bit later, this can also be a very queer way to think about media because it's challenging, again, that value system of a normal way to approach narrative or media. So how does this focus on feeling equate to the body? Well, basically, it's because it's the body is what actually feels things, right? So literally through the senses, right? Your body feels, but also emotionally. So for instance, when you're watching a movie or a TV show or something, some kind of media, and maybe you're reminded of something sad or something scary or something funny, right? And your body reacts to that memory. So you start crying, perhaps you tense up, perhaps you laugh, even if actually that's not happening to you, right? And even if your mind, like if you're watching a scary movie, for instance, and your mind is like, it's not happening to us, we're fine, we're safe on our couch, right? Or we don't need to be scared, everything's fine. Right? Like you can kind of tell yourself all these kinds of things, but perhaps your body is like, nope, I'm still scared, still tensed, still kind of like freaking out a little bit. And affect theory basically gives us a space to engage how the body is feeling, regardless of what the mind thinks, right? So all the times that you can't stop feeling tense or scared, or the times you can't stop crying, even though you know rationally and logically that you should, right? Affect theory gives us that space to appreciate that, right? And to kind of approach that and talk about media with an attention to that dimension. So hopefully what's becoming clear through this is that the body is an integral part of thinking about affect, right? And embodiment is an integral part of this. And in fact, when we study affect in media, and when we take like a narrative or a media text and say, like, what are its affective dimensions? Often we actually look to the body as a sign of that affect. So we look to physical movements, we look to bodily gestures, facial reactions, and so on. Because of course it's our bodies that actually perform or showcase what we're feeling or what emotions are happening, right? When we're sad, we cry. When we're scared, we tense up, and so on, right? So we kind of look to the body as a way of understanding what's happening emotionally or affectively. So we think about this in regards to something like San Junipero. Affective theory is what basically allows us or gives us the space to kind of value the ways that that episode might make us feel, right? So, or even a ways to like talk about how that episode makes us feel as like a valued conversation, right? So it's what allows us to say that it's important that we are engaged in this relationship, or to even to acknowledge that it's important, like the ways that in the ending we're maybe like, yeah, drive that red convertible, like this is awesome, and maybe you feel kind of warm and fuzzy and bubbly inside, right? Even though you're kind of also watching this and maybe trying to figure out what the technology is about, or trying to figure out like the technical secret, right? That's kind of a mind practice. But affect theory would say that the episode, because it does both, right? It makes us feel and it makes us kind of try to figure out and rationalize. Affect theory is what gives us the space to appreciate the feelings that are prompted by this episode, not just kind of thinking through the particular problem that it sets up, right? And then one final thing that I want to talk about in terms of affect theory and affect studies is that just as it kind of asks us to approach media and how we experience media differently, it also prompts us to think about labor and work differently. Again, right, we're back at the body because it's the body that labors. So specifically though, what affect does is it asks us to acknowledge and think about the work of being emotional, right? Or the work that emotions require of us. And so this is often called like emotional labor or even affective labor. And I do want to just kind of bring this up, one, because it's an important part of affect theory, but also because this is really kind of having a moment right now. And it's something that I think it's important to keep in mind and to kind of champion right now. So right now you've maybe seen kind kind of all over the web, I think this is like everywhere, are these kinds of calls to like be kind to yourself, right? That even if you're continuing with your studies or continuing with your work or trying to do all these things, again, based in your mind, right? Like intellectual pursuits like college, even though you need to continue with that, it's also these calls to acknowledge that like your body and your feelings are like having their own moment right now that might be independent of that, and that to kind of acknowledge that there's real affective labor going on because there's a pandemic going on, right? And that creates different kinds of stresses, different kinds of emotions, different kinds of reactions in your body and in like a feeling zone rather than a thinking zone, right? That you are not entirely in charge of, right? And so these calls to be kind to yourself are to create space because of affective theory, right? To say, on the one hand, great, continue with your intellectual mind-based work, but also know that like you're going to feel, and it's okay if that happens. And it's okay if that's going on, right? Because that's also a real form of work and labor. And then kind of related to that, perhaps you all saw this meme, which kind of had a minute earlier this year and at the end of last year, that again is kind of bringing this idea of affective labor and the labor of emotions into kind of a more popular, culturally popular zone, which is kind of asking us and requiring that we acknowledge that emotions and feelings are a form of work, and that they can tire us out just as physical labor does. Though again, like historically and culturally, this isn't something that we focus on, right? We are not always aware of the ways that our bodies become tired, and we become tired by work that is not physical. Right? We're going to turn now to our next point here, which is queerness, and thinking queerness as a cultural and media studies term. Okay, so you had a short reading on queerness as a kind of cultural studies or media studies term. And so for the rest of this video, that's what I'm going to primarily kind of focus on, both as it relates to San Junipero and kind of more broadly within kind of a cultural studies and academic studies position. So I am going to start with trying to articulate queerness as a category for humanities cultural studies. So first, I think coming from 2020, right, the term queer is not really new, right? It's very much kind of part of our everyday speech, our everyday parlance. It's part of the kind of broader LGBTQ plus umbrella, and in some ways kind of currently has the status of being a reclaimed word that was once a slur, but now for some people can operate as a kind of blanket term or umbrella term for any kind of non-normative sexuality that perhaps doesn't fall into another one of the categories in the LGBTQ plus acronym, right? So the thing to keep in mind, though, is that even though now it is kind of a popular term, it does kind of have this reclaimed status. The history of that term as a slur and as a negative term is important, right, to keep in mind. So even though throughout this video and academic study and so on, it really kind of embraces that name and names things as queer, right, and embraces that term. That doesn't mean that history no longer exists, right, or that it's not in some ways there. So it is something to kind of keep in mind that I'm not evacuating the term of its history by using it here, but rather kind of using it in its kind of like reclaimed mode, right? So queerness as a reclaim mode, as I said, now kind of can operate as this umbrella term for any kind of non-normative sexuality. So by non-normative sexuality, that basically means sexuality that isn't bound to Western traditions of heterosexuality or heteropatriarchy. So I'll define both of those terms. First, heterosexuality is sexual desire, right, between a man and a woman as kind of this heterosexual mode. And then heteropatriarchy kind of expands that a bit to be more about gender roles, right? And so thinking about, so that tends to refer to the gender roles that stem from and kind of work within this heterosexual relationship, right? So things where like the man is the breadwinner and the head of the household and so on. And then the woman is like the domestic worker. She kind of takes care of the kids, right? And so on. And because of the ways that heterosexuality and heteropatriarchy have historically dictated what are like the norms of Western culture, right? So things that are considered normal. We can put these two things together under a wide umbrella of heteronormativity, right? Which simply refers to the sense of normalcy or normalness that comes from traditions and values based on heterosexual and heteropatriarchal cultures, right? Which is, of course, basically where Western culture comes from. So queerness as a category and as a category for thinking about media or cultural studies stems from this position of queerness as relating to or referring to relationships that don't operate within the confines of heteronormativity. But what kind of happens is that once we start really picking apart heteronormativity and all the different values and things that we just kind of make assumptions about, once we start really picking that apart, we can see how many things are tied to these histories, right? And especially about how we interface with the world, right? And what's considered appropriate, what's considered correct, and so on, right? So norms such as those that dictate what's considered excess, norms that talk about that excess is not a good thing, right? Not a desirable thing. Norms that set like rules and guidelines for appropriateness, for correctness, right? Especially when thinking about media consumption, right? We kind of see when we take apart heteronormativity that all of these kinds of rules and guidelines stem from this kind of wide-reaching heteronormativity throughout Western culture. And Karen Tongson early in this piece kind of refers to this. So this is what she's talking about when she notes that there are what she calls definitional problems or definitional challenges that arise when we try to academically or otherwise really kind of lock down a definition of what queer is or what queerness is or even what queer theory is. In her words, she says, at times, queer has come to mean a particular set of sexual practices, positions, and proclivities. So queerness as a marker of desire, right, and sexual desire specifically. Then she says, in the past 15 years or so, scholars have vigorously debated whether or not queer constitutes any form of anti-normativity. So this is directly relating to what I've just said about as we break down heteronormativity, we see how many parts of our culture, what's considered like normal within our culture are tied to these structures. So this is kind of that question of like, does queerness have to be related to heteronormativity, or can it be related to any kind of normativity at all? And then finally, she says, some of the field's fundamental questions continue to ask things like, is queer an identity? Is queer an orientation? Is it a method? Is it a practice of reading, of seeing, or hearing? And so this kind of big statement by Karen Tongson is basically an overview of what the academic field of queer theory and queer studies kind of focuses on. And I do want to be really clear that I am not going to answer all these questions today. These are major debates within the field. I'm really just kind of drawing your attention to it here so that you have a sense of it, both kind of as it operates and some sense of the major questions that the field grapples with. So the thing, though, that does seem to be consistent across queer theory, though, and across this kind of positioning that you can kind of take away, is that the queer position is a non-normative position. And I want to be clear that I'm using normative specifically, not normal, right? So normative and normal are, of course, related. They have to do with norms. But normative is specifically a way of saying, like, things that are considered normal because culture says so, not because there's any kind of actual inherent or natural normalcy to it. I'm specifically using the term normative there rather than normal to kind of draw that attention that this is a cultural construction of normalcy. So across queer theory, though, to get back to kind of this things that you can kind of hold on to, the queer position is a non-normative position, and more specifically, it tends to be a position that is non-normative regarding desires and consumptions, right? So with this in mind, right? I'm going to turn now to thinking about queer studies and queer theory in relation to media and media studies, and highlight a few key parts of Tongsen's essay with some examples from popular culture today to try and give you kind of, again, a sense of entry into this quick piece. So first, one key thing that Tongsen talks about in terms of queerness and media is about representation, right? So this has to do with queer representation in the media and how this plays out. So positive, affirming representation, does it reiterate the status of a queer character as like non-normative or wrong, and things like that. So when we talk about representation, that's kind of the question, is like, where do we see queer characters and queer stories being represented in our media? And today, again, from 2020, there's a lot of representation. So we kind of see this all over in places like Modern Family, Orange is the New Black, The 100, Kimmy Schmidt, Schitt's Creek, Queer Eye, RuPaul's Drag Race, Transparent, Call Me By Your Name, obviously San Junipero, right? There's lots, right? And these are just a few kind of literally off the top of my head while prepping this lecture. I'm sure you could think of even more. So in all these kind of cases where we see lots of different characters that are queer in some way, some questions that queer theory would want us to keep in mind, though, when critically engaging beyond just representation, is first, it kind of would say, like, simply being there is a great first step, but it's maybe not enough. So we need to kind of approach this with other questions in mind. So for instance, what kind of story do the queer characters get? Do they get a good story, an affirming story, or is it a negative story that perhaps teaches us the wrongness of this position? Are the queer characters presented as normal, multifaceted people, or is kind of everything reducible to the fact of their queerness, right? Can they do other things besides just be queer? Are the queer characters punished for being queer, right? And we can think about this both at the level of the story, right? So are there other characters within the story that punish them because of their queer position? Or are they punished in more broad ways, like being written out of the storyline, or being killed off, right, by the writers and things like that? Do the queer characters live basically a normative life that's just not based in a heterosexual relationship, as in something like Modern Family, where we see Mitch and Cam, though clearly in a gay relationship, they have kids together, they live in a nice house, they basically have these jobs and they basically live what we would kind of look at as a normal life. So a very normative, a homonormative life that just happens to not be heterosexual. Or do the queer characters get to live queerly in other ways, perhaps in ways that are not bound to traditions of domestic family structures? Maybe they're not married, or maybe there's multiple partners in like a kind of polyamorous situation or open relationship or something like that. Because there are, of course, other ways of living queerly than simply to be in a queer but otherwise basically normative relationship, right? If we're looking at something like lesbians, another question that we can ask and that Karen Tongsen specifically asks is, are they femme, right? So are they basically just reiterating traditions of femininity, but just, again, happen to be lesbians? Or can they be butch? Can they be more masculine? Can we see masculine representations of women? Right, and that's again kind of just another question to think about, right? So there's other questions that that queer theory would bring to critically engaging representation, but these are just kind of a few to kind of get you started kind of thinking further. And I do want to clarify that these questions aren't necessarily about calling things out for not being queer enough, though certainly they could be, right? Rather, they're more about things to keep in mind when we're thinking more broadly and more expansively about queerness and about queer representation in media. So it's more expansive critical possibilities for showing and embracing life outside of heteropatriarchal and heteronormative structures, right? So it's thinking again about just kind of more broadly about queer representation than simply to have queer relationships on screen. So a second point that she makes is that queerness can operate as a method for taking in and for interpreting a story. So the queer position, and the way that this kind of works, is that the queer position is one that is kind of always making space in a world or a culture that is not set up to affirm that position, right? So it's always kind of not necessarily at odds or in a struggle with it, but always kind of articulating a mode of existing and a mode of being that is affirmative in a world that is not meant for them. So this can be like interpreting texts or finding space in texts, even when those texts are not explicitly celebrating queerness or not made for queer audiences. So some examples of this are like recently Ursula from The Little Mermaid has kind of been reinscribed as an example of like a butch lesbian on screen. And of course, The Little Mermaid doesn't go into that in the story. That's not the story that they tell. But part of this queer negotiation of media is about finding these spaces and kind of creating these spaces that otherwise may not be there. Another example, again, from Disney is someone like Elsa as a queer icon, because of course the entire story of Frozen is about her hiding some integral part of her being, being like literally closeted and closed off with these gloves, and then finally being able to kind of let it go and be who she is, right? So kind of this reading of Elsa as like a metaphor for queerness and for being closeted, and for not living in a world that's, or for needing to create space in a world that's not meant for her so that she can be who she is. And then a final example of this is something that I mentioned in the fan lecture last week of looking at characters like Poe and Finn in Star Wars, where again, Star Wars really is a pretty heteronormative text, all things considered. And yet we kind of have this long, or not long, but this rich like popular critique within the fandom of reading Poe and Finn as these two, as in this kind of queer relationship with one another, right? Another way, though, of kind of taking queerness as a method is not necessarily reading queer situations and queer moments into narrative, but of the way that you take the narrative as such, right? So it's about rejecting normative modes of media interpretation or media consumption. So this can be norms, for instance, that say like what are appropriate amounts of media, or what is good media or good television. And this is another thing that Thompson spends kind of a long time on in her short piece. So she mentions, for instance, the latchkey kid as a figure of the overconsumption of media or the excessive consumption of media as kind of a queer figure. So two things to kind of draw your attention to here to kind of make this a bit, to help kind of clarify this. So first, the latchkey kid, as she kind of says, is the kid who comes home after school, there's no adult supervision, and they just get to kind of binge media consumption with no rules, no guidelines. They just watch whatever they want, however they want. So they become kind of the figure of like excessive overconsumption of media. And so the first thing to note here is that normativity would say that there are guidelines and appropriate amounts of media that we should consume, and that we should seek to not be excessive, right? So on the one hand, this is queer simply because it is rejecting that norm that says, you know, be like limit yourself and don't embrace excess. But kind of more interesting, or like kind of a deeper reading of this, I think, is the second point, which is that and about excess and queerness. So queerness, again, if we kind of think historically, is a position that has historically been based in denial, right? In denying desires, in not acting upon them, in limiting or stopping feelings, and so on. And of course, excess is the opposite of denial, right? So to live in excess and to kind of allow yourself to be who you are and to have these feelings and to not deny them, right, is kind of this queer position. So queerness becomes this position that celebrates excess, right, and that kind of embraces this lack of denial by instead this kind of overconsumption or excessive mode of being. And then a final point that Tongson makes within this kind of broader category of queer interpretations is about reality TV, and specifically Bravo, the network. So this is again one where the queer position, again, remember, is one that is embraces non-normative desires and non-normative tastes. So in this case, it's like embracing and really loving what would be normatively considered trashy TV, right? And then and at the same time, many of these reality TV shows, what we kind of see being played out are non-normative ways of being in the show. So things like non-normative domestic work in something like a cooking competition, or non-normative relationship processes in dating shows, right? All of these are ultimately working against models of what is like accepted, appropriate, correct, normal, and so on, right? And because of that, that's also why they get kind of put under this mode of being considered trashy TV, right? Okay, and then one final point that I'll make before turning specifically to San Junipero is this reference that Tongson makes throughout to queer world building through media, right? And this is related to as well the queer iOS, or the queer OS, that she references too. So again, this has to do with ways that, because the world is not built for queer positions, this is a way of being in the world and of creating space and negotiating space in a world that's not necessarily made for you, often by taking what you're given and then kind of using that to remake the world, or to imagine a newer world, both within like maybe a media narrative itself, or in kind of a real life mode. So this is, again, kind of this world building practice is we can kind of see that happening in queer readings of non-queer texts, right? So reading queer relationships, even though the text doesn't give them to you, but it can also be like queer world building in the narrative itself. So creating your narrative around a world that is in some way like a non-normative or queer world. And I think like a great example of this is something like Schitt's Creek, where not only do we have kind of reaffirmed queer characters, but we also have this kind of really non-normative mode of living with this family that's like had this fall from grace. They're kind of these like reality TV shows, like the Kardashians a little bit. Moira is like the soap opera actress, right? And they live in a motel in this like, you know, the middle of nowhere with these kind of like funky characters, right? So it's this really kind of queer world that, besides that, really kind of celebrates and reaffirms throughout these different queer characters and queer relationships and queer modes of being, right? Okay, so to close out, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the ways that we see a lot of these points I've been making about queer theory and queerness, how it resonates in San Junipero. And hopefully some of this is already kind of resonating, but just to kind of go through quickly is that first, kind of, we of course have representation, right? At the core of this text is a queer love story that between Kelly and Yorkie, right? But because of this kind of critical assessment of representation, we would maybe want to be careful about celebrating this too much, since of course both Kelly and Yorkie are traditionally feminine characters, and it seems like they set up a fairly normative domestic life once they get to San Junipero. Right, they get married, they kind of have the house by the beach, and they kind of have this this fairly normative domestic life. But some other things that we see happening, though, about where we can kind of articulate some other spaces of queerness are some of the other things that this episode does to resist normative guides or normative ideals. So for instance, there's this kind of norm of how we should live and how we should die that the text really rejects, right, and celebrates the rejection of. So of course, at the end, they kind of choose to do this like radical non-normative thing and live forever in San Junipero, right? And this goes against all the norms of Western living, which would say like you're supposed to die when it's your time to die. So this is both kind of a radical choice to make, and it's a pretty queer choice to make, because it is resisting that normative ideal of how to live, right, or the right way to live and the right way to die. Another norm that we see the text kind of playing with is the norm of monogamy, between Kelly's choice to join Yorkie and San Junipero rather than to die and kind of as her husband and her daughter did. And this is a point in the text that's often really conflicting, right? And I've seen a lot of your discussion posts noting that like you're conflicted in this moment, and that's absolutely okay. It is conflicting, right? Like it's kind of hard to know what we're supposed to make of that. But sitting with that conflict is, again, like an acceptable, both queer and affective thing to do, right? Because it's not rationalizing it into one way or the other, but rather letting it kind of be all of those things, right? It's letting it be excessive. It's letting it be conflicting. It's letting it be unsettled, right? And kind of related to this, we also see this show kind of playing with excess, especially with media, right? We see Yorkie really excessively embracing San Junipero. She has no holds barred here. And then we also see within San Junipero that there's lots of different spaces for thinking about and letting people experience excessive lifestyles, right? In these different like club scenes and so on. So it's really not a space about moderating what people experience, but rather that is about living in excess. Right. And especially if we think about that with regards to media consumption and virtual reality, I think that as we're watching this, right, one of the things that maybe is running in the back of your mind is like, no, we're not supposed to like fall completely into VR. We're not supposed to embrace media like this. But of course, that's what the text kind of is playing with here, right? Is like letting us be excessive in media and letting that be okay. And then another thing that I'll just point out is that kind of related to affect is that Black Mirror and science fiction kind of as a genre more broadly are supposed to make us think, right? That to make us think about technology and to make us think about how we are in the world. And this is an episode that, I mean, it makes us think, but it really, I think, more makes us feel, right? It makes us feel deeply about different things and it's not really about playing through like the mind-based thought experiment. And even more interestingly, and again, this is something that a lot of you have noted in your discussion posts, is that it makes us feel in a way that is positive and affirming, not in a way that is full of dread or fear or anxiety, right? And then a final point is that we also see this theme of world building in San Junipero, where just as there's kind of this queer tradition of creating, taking what you can of the world that you're given and building a world for you, that's literally what San Junipero is, right? It's this like built world for the for what everybody wants, for the kind of life they want, and so on, right? Okay, so this is getting pretty long. And there's of course tons more that can be said on any one of these topics. More to be said on affect, more to be said on queer theory, more to be said on San Junipero. And I certainly hope that you'll bring a lot of that to the facilitation next week. So hopefully this, I know this was long, but I hope that it clarifies and helps to focus some of the points made in the readings. And as always, I look forward to seeing your discussion posts and to hearing your thoughts on the episode. And I look forward to seeing you, hopefully, at the facilitation next week.